Hello, and we are live. I haven't done a live for a while, and it's great to be back live across three platforms. And this is the start of a four-part series on disruptive leadership. And, you know, we're living in such a VUCA, volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous time. And, you know, I think organizations are crying out for direction, purpose, et cetera, et cetera. And so I've got a wonderful guest for these four episodes. Why we need disruptive leadership. A guest by the name of Paul McCarthy. Paul, how are you? Sorry, my system just went there for a second. Paul McCarthy, how are you? Great to see you. And so Paul is a speaker on disruptive leadership. He is a positive disruptor of the status quo, which I love. He's a catalyst and author of Fired Leadership, a book that I've read. I know we're going to use that to frame the conversation. And really the purpose of these four episodes is to demystify myths and to kind of reframe people's thinking about what is leadership, what does it need to be, what direction does it need to take? And also for me, as somebody who's a trainer and a coach, do we need to think about leadership training in different ways? One of the things that drives me crazy is that, you know, traditional leadership training talks a lot about principles and processes and paradigms and et cetera, et cetera. Whereas what I find leaders are craving for is practical steps to do things like to inspire, to build trust, to delegate, et cetera, et cetera. So I think we'll cover all of those things. So without further ado, Paul, you know, we'll get onto the book in a second, but you know, you're an expert in disruptive leadership. Why do you think leadership and leadership training is broken?
Yeah, thank you, Simon. Good to see you again. And you know, whenever someone says disruptor, I see people roll their eyes, because that's exactly what I'm doing this for, is to dispel people's myths about what disruption and what a disruptor means. So, you know, it's good to be on this platform and talk to you. So I've been working in this field for many years, and only in the last 5 years, more recently, looking at under the covers and lifting the hood, as they say, the bonnet in the UK, and looking at the true state of leadership today. And I mean, when I say leadership, I mean identification, recruitment, onboarding, and development of leaders. And it's broken, and few want to acknowledge that. And the reason it's broken, well, there are many, but one of the main ones is that we're not preparing our leaders for the future, and we're not preparing them with the qualities that they'll need to navigate ongoing disruption. We still think that the learning and development that may have worked 25 years ago is relevant today, and the modalities, we use the same modalities. We very seldomly ask leaders what they want to learn. We never engage leaders in the metrics of success that we want them to be determined, you know, in terms of how effective the learning is. We never have an end-to-end route that says the leader wants this learning, they do this learning, they know it works, this is how it actually applies in their day-to-day role. And really just the icing on the cake for this is that almost $400 billion is spent annually developing leaders. And I've said this before in other public forums, only 14% of people who buy that leadership development thinks it works. So we're putting a different shade of lipstick on the same pig, and we haven't adapted to the fact that COVID, as tragic as it is and has been, is an accelerated lever that's showing us we need a different way to educate our leaders, to bring them on, to recruit them, to onboard them, and to work with them. So, you know, I can wax lyrical about all the stats and all the research that I've just connected the dots on, but essentially we're not preparing leaders with the right type of learning in the right way. We're not listening to our leaders, and we expect them to go out and apply learning that they've never really wanted to learn anyway. And so anyone listening, that's the first thing I'd suggest. You know, ask your leaders by a different leader level. In fact, take a sample, emerging leaders or entry-level leaders. Just ask a sample of them. What do they want to lead? What do they want to learn? And then put them through a pilot. See how more productive they are compared to the cut and paste leadership development that you already put them through. That's my first invite.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And I think, you know, because I do a lot of leadership training, a lot of leadership coaching, and, you know, I'm often brought in to kind of, for want of a better expression, repair what hasn't happened in the past with previous trainers and coaches. And what often comes up is that, you know, we were amazed that the previous trainer didn't actually ask us what we needed, what we wanted, and so before I do any training or coaching, I always send a questionnaire out, or I invariably send a question out asking, what do you need? What do people think they need? What would they like to see? And it's always the practical stuff. How do I actually delegate? How do I actually motivate? How do I actually build trust? How do I prevent a breakdown in trust between leadership and the rest of the team, and practical steps to do that? And so I guess my next question is, why do you think, or what is it going to take to break this vicious cycle of not dealing with this, to get people to start changing their mind and start dealing with this?
Yeah, there's so much in that question. I mean, let me just set the macro level for you, right? Anyone that's aware of or not aware of, I urge them to become aware of what I'm about to explain. There's a report that every year is published called the Global Innovation Index report. And the Global Innovation Index report is basically an overview of the world's most innovative countries. And so there's a top 25 and there's a bottom 25. There's over 200 countries in the world. So there's a lot to play with. And so one of the revealing things for me, but disturbing for our listeners, because this is going to show them why we need to address this and why we keep getting stuck in not addressing it. But there's a clear link between disruptive leadership potential and high performance of companies that lead to high performance and GDP prosperity of countries. So I think it was Korn Ferry that researched this a few years ago and found they researched about 800 different investors into companies in high growth countries. And they found that, over 80% of organizations in China and in Asia will not invest in companies where the leadership in those companies is focused on disruption, right? So just think about that for a moment. Our future country's ability to be innovative, and by the way, Ireland and the UK are in the top 10, but this comes to another reason that why we don't address this, and it's about paradigms and ego, but that's a whole other thing.
Yeah.
But the future GDP growth of countries around the world actually depends on the organization's ability and capability to identify, recruit, onboard, and develop and keep disruptive leadership talent. So just think about that as for every organization out there, and every time we talk about this subject, disruptive leadership is the future currency for countries' ability to remain innovative. So we need to start educating in our organizations, our leadership development, for that type of quality. So what I've found keeps people from looking at this and actually taking this seriously is because a lot of people are fearful. A lot of people think, nobody gets fired for hiring IBM kind of mentality, right? Yeah. And what we think has worked in the past is going to get us in the future. Now, what this is all wrapped up in as well, this is quite controversial because a lot of people I speak to, VPs of HR, chief people officers, chief innovation officers, they don't want to rock the boat, Simon. They don't want to upset the apple cart because everybody's going in this direction, and I call it groupthink. And we need to be going in this direction because there's a complacency, which is, I'm a few years from retirement, so why should I actually question anything? And I think what we're seeing is the next generation of leaders and the next generation who hold the purse strings. I mean, I already sent out an article a few days ago, is are we ready for Generation Z in terms of how that generation approaches leadership? And I mean, are Generation Z ready, but are the organizations ready to embrace a different expectation from that generation of leaders about how they want to lead? Because they're going to vote with their feet, Simon. In fact, they already are. People are walking out of organizations because they're not being given the leadership development they need and want. So we're coming to a next, this is a tidal shift moment, and we're coming to a cliff. And very few people thought I was serious or had any credibility 4 years ago. 4 years later, now people are starting to wake up to this, and it's a matter of time, really.
You're spot on. I'm dealing with a couple of clients right now, and The challenge in those clients is, as you said, there's a perception, and I think it's probably more than a perception across the workforce, that the leadership don't want change, or they are confronted or intimidated by change, or too much change, too many different new ways of thinking, etc. And yet, on the other hand, the leadership are saying, we need innovation, right? You can't have innovation if you don't have a change mindset, if you don't have a growth mindset. And so, I think the leadership teams, if they're not careful, are going to lose workforce members, because the workforce members, and you mention it right at the beginning of your book, which you'll mention in a second, you say, and this is a direct, one of the first bullet points, modern leadership culture is rife with hypocrisy. And so what maybe expand on that a little bit. I think what I just said is an example, but expand on that a little bit.
Yeah. Oh, you're throwing me in at the deep end here, Simon. Love it. I've said it publicly. I've said it in the organizations that have fired me as an executive leader. I've said it in the leadership development trainings that I've given, and I base it on there's a lot of things, but the 3 data points, and I can't remember if I put this in that section of the book or not, because as you know, writing a book is such a cumbersome, long, protracted process to just write it and then get it published. But I call it the 3 data points. And I've been the leadership consultant that's come in to work with C-suite, the board of directors. And I've spent days with them developing their strat plans and their one-page glossy laminate menus that stick on the wall by the elevators or lifts for anyone in the UK. And it's leadership, integrity. We lead with honor. We are authentic, right? That's the first data point. And I've been brought in, much like you, paid a handsome fee to develop these things, right? Okay, then you go away and you think, great. Okay, second data point. I go into the C-suite offices, and I'm talking about every level of leader. Go into their office and you see the books they read on leadership, and you've got some of the classics, and it's amazing to see. And then in the third data point, you then see the way they lead. And there's a complete incongruence, and I'm going to repeat that word, an incongruence between those 3 data points. And nobody wants to talk about it. One of my clients I've put in the book, and lovely client, lovely organization, does some great things, some great leaders in that organization. But I went to the top of the tree in their organization to talk about dysfunction and leadership misalignment. They practically did this to each other, saying, it's not my fault, it's their fault. Right. And then I walked back to the elevator to the lift, and to get the lift down from the top floor down to the ground floor. And I saw their competency framework, and that's on every level of every floor. And it talks about we have each other's backs. That's a prime leadership behavior. But you tell me, Simon, does this mean that we have each other's backs?
Absolutely.
No. So that's an example of leadership hypocrisy. And here's the thing. I'm not shaming anyone in our industry at all, but I do need to say that, because very often no one says this, is we've been propagating a broken system by assuming that what worked may have worked 25 years ago will work now. But one of the things that we've seen in the research is that if we don't adapt to changing requirements, COVID was one of them, right? There'll be more, then we will not keep up. And so I guess that's a big thing that we need to address in the next few years. And very few people like to talk about leadership hypocrisy. And we can soften it, but the reality is we're wasting billions every year by sidestepping this issue.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I see the comments are starting to come in now. The identifications are starting to come in. It's great to see Ambassador Terry Earthwind Nichols, a great friend of mine over from the States, and some clappy or happy hands there from somebody else. And I've got to be very careful, because if I start talking about some of the companies I work for, I might start identifying them. But I've seen it. I've been brought into places to address issues and to garner input from all members of staff, created amazing, nice looking reports. And then the very person or the very issue that I say needs to be addressed is the very person who gets promoted, because I think there's just a fear within organizations to actually address the real issues. And they just keep kicking the can down the road. You were going to say something.
I was, and I won't name this individual. I love them dearly. They've become very important to me in my life. And so let me just start this by a little anecdote. 4 years ago, I started this whole journey to start talking about hypocrisy in leadership and reframing the narrative and introducing a different type of leader that we need. Most people thought I was crazy. Family members walked away from me. Romantic partners walked away from me. Friends dismissed and marginalized me. For all of them that are listening, I have no bitterness or anger. I'm actually so swelled with positive emotion that we've got to a point where we're actually changing the narrative and the conversation about this now. And some of those people, well, you'll know this, Simon, because you've read my book and you're endorsing my book. Many others, great people, are endorsing my book. That some well-known leadership experts around the world. But 4 years ago, some of these people thought that my work was a little bit too excessive, right?
Too provocative, maybe too real.
Too real. And actually, some of them in their offline comments to me said, I've worked with only a handful of leaders who have the fired leadership traits. But these are the traits we need for future leaders to be successful. But they've worked with thousands upon thousands of leaders in all sorts of organizations around the globe. Yet very few of those leaders possess the qualities, leadership qualities, needed to navigate the future. Now, you tell me why we still have an environment where we have to keep that behind the scenes, and why we can't talk to organizations about the very real reality of the state of their leadership systems and processes.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And a good friend of mine from Edinburgh, who I hope to see in a week or so's time, Mike Stevenson, has this. He mentions, I heard a great analogy about spreadsheet leadership, which is kind of what we're talking about. Imagine if a tennis player was to watch the scoreboard rather than their opponent. And, it's very frustrating for people like you and I who see, we get paid to do these things, and then often we get ignored. And that's fine if the client wants to take it that way. But you can just see that they are, to grow, you need to innovate. To innovate, you need diversity of thought, and et cetera, et cetera. And if you're not open-minded and you don't have a growth mindset, you're not going to innovate and you're not going to grow. And it's going to inevitably be a vicious cycle. And I worry, as you say, I worry for a lot of companies. The change is coming, and the younger generations are seeing it. And so I guess my next question then is, if you were going to imagine if you were going to go to if I introduce you to a new client, right? And I said, I've got this great guy, Paul Mack, and he wants to talk to you about disruptive leadership. How would you start addressing it with them, right? They've never heard about it. They're old school thinkers. How would you hold their hand through the process? What would you say to them?
Yeah, and so the answer may surprise you, because I would bring them along on a story, and I'd ask them what was important to them in leadership and leaders, and what they were looking for. I'd say, do you want leaders that are purpose driven? Do you want leaders that see the bigger picture and build trust quickly, and they're curious and they innovate? Yes or no? Okay, yes. Do you want, because I don't think there's a person out there that's going to answer no to what I'm about to say. Do you want leaders that think of the big picture and improvement focused, and they can cultivate an environment and culture quickly that embraces innovation? Yes or no? Great. Do you want leaders to be agile and adapt and be able to adapt their own approach to keep up with the demands of transformation? Yes or no? Great. Do you want leaders that think differently and introduce different ways of seeing problems? Yes or no? Okay. And do you want them to be transparent, and do you want them to be able to demonstrate vulnerability and be authentic? Yes or no? And if they answer yes to all of those questions, then what I've just developed for them is the 5 or 6 qualities that disruptive leaders are characterized by. In fact, I've developed a disruptive leader framework that's based upon leading research globally that shows, surprisingly, that disruptive leaders are characterized by all of those things I've just said. They're purpose-driven, they're empathetic, big picture thinkers, they're adaptable, they're divergent, they're decisive, they make decisions quickly, and they're transparent. Who would not want a leader for the future in their organization like that? You tell me, because if you tell me you don't, then chief people officer, HR VP, CEO, whoever's listening to this in real time or retrospectively, then you're not going to have the leaders for the future that you need to thrive and be economically successful. That's it, period, end of.
Yeah, I think one of the challenges that there is an addiction. I think some of the senior leadership teams and maybe HR teams, there's an addiction to the old broken way. And so when somebody like you and I, and Mike Stevenson as well, Mike Stevenson, I would say, is another significant disruptor, and also Ambassador Terry, when we come along, there's almost a kind of sense of, well, disbelief, because there's such a concrete body of bad leadership or misguiding leadership training and thinking that it's very, very hard. And it's great to see for disruptive thinkers to get traction. It's great to see Sukendo Pal here as well, a great leadership mind as well. And one of the things I think he's saying, how does one lead successfully in a disruptive and even chaotic world? And let me just put that up, and you can have a look at it. I think you can have a look at it yourself. But I guess that's worth just resting on that point. Given that we have so much chaos, does this make it easier or harder or even easier to prove your point?
Well, the first thing, so I'm just reading this comment here about leading successfully in a disruptive, even chaotic world. Well, the first thing we need to do is we need to embrace disruptive thinking, which means we have to create the conditions for having a disruptive leadership and organizational culture be normalized, right? So something underpinning my work is to shift from what everybody will understand as we've normalized dysfunction to normalizing disruption. But let's make it less of a dirty word. So what we do then, we build it into our synapse. You talked earlier offline about growth mindset. We need to change our mindset about the word disruption. So we bake it into the culture. It's expected. Can you imagine a disruptive leader maturity model at enterprise level that actually recruits leaders based on how disruptive they are? Because there's a clear correlation, as I mentioned earlier, between the ability to disrupt and high performance, right? There is a clear linkage. It's unequivocal. You cannot disprove it. So, and it's been proven many times. So the first thing, we need to fertilize, like Amy Edmondson says, we need to create the conditions, the fertile soil. We need to embrace disruptive thinking, right? I call that fresh thinking in my FIRED methodology. We need to normalize this. Once we've done that, we need to create environments with leadership teams where they can talk openly about disruption. I've developed things called name what you see moments, where I've worked with a lot of leadership teams that are dysfunctional because they're all silo-based thinkers, and they're behaving in ways that are really only self-serving. So did you know that in itself, Simon, and the contributor to this question that led us to answer this, that contributes to about $223 billion every year in toxic organizational culture. Yeah. Just think about that. That's amidst the 8 trillion that Gallup estimates for global disengagement. So, I mean, the evidence is mounting up. We need to shift the paradigms in our leadership cultures. And we need to start that by basically, this might sound very simple and trite, but we need to have a conversation with ourselves first. We need to become self-aware. We need to wake up. Then we need to start talking to our peers. Then we need to start to create the type of culture that we want to see future generations of leaders thrive in. And it's not easy. It's not easy.
Yeah. No, it's not. And just a shout out to a friend of mine, Eduardo Brasenio in the States, who is a world leading expert in growth mindset. He has a new book coming out. I think it's coming out next month or in November. And it's called The Performance Paradox. And there's a bit of a plug for the book. It's a fantastic concept, and I'm sure it's going to be a great book. It's about how you can link growth mindset and different ways of thinking to performance. There's a direct link, and I think that's what you're talking about, is that I think leaders need to think this is not just about some external reality and just grabbing some sort of concept outside you. This starts with the mindset of thinkers, and so of leaders, right? It starts with mindset and shift in mindset, and so I'm sure that's going to be a great piece of work. And just back to the book, you talk about FIRED, F-I-R-E-D, and we're going to explore these in the next 3 sessions. And F is fresh thinking, I is inquisitive nature, R is real and accountable, E is expressive and challenging, and D is direct and transparent. Maybe just take us through that a little bit. for somebody who hasn't read the book yet, maybe just summarize what do you mean by those 5 different concepts: fresh thinking, intuitive nature, etc., etc.
Before I do that, I just wanted to close off the other segment with some also compelling research. It was an exec headhunter, Heidrick and Struggles. They talked about this pre-pandemic, that a leader's ability to be disruptive maximizes their potential as a leader, right? And then DDI corroborated that by saying, if you're disruptive and embrace disruptive leadership qualities, you're 4.3 times more likely to outperform your leadership peer. So I'm going to leave that as a stat for people to, growth mindset or fixed mindset. You let me know, listeners, how that's resonating in your synapse. These are unequivocal facts. So the future's here, embrace it, or you've left, the train's left the station and you've left, you're not on it. So fired. I'm sure we'll talk about this another time, but essentially I spent about 12 months researching the state of leadership today. And I found that the leadership qualities that we were developing in leaders were not fit for what was coming on the horizon. I started this whole journey, by the way, at the end of 2017, right? Before the largest global human capital experiment called COVID in history. So it was my job to stay on top of the trends and see what leaders needed in order to be developed to be successful and thrive. When I was fired as an exec leader 4 times, most of my world and my family and my friends said, you're just a guy who doesn't fit in, you've been fired. And I said, no, that's not it. I think there's something broken about leadership. So I'm going to go out and see if my hypothesis is correct, which is, are we firing the talent we need to navigate ongoing disruption? Basically, this was 2017. I spent a year researching leadership programs around the world, and I found that these 5 areas were missing or underplayed, underestimated from how we were developing leaders. In fact, it went deeper, how we identified, recruited, onboarded, and developed leaders. And then I started this quest, and that's what's led me to talking to people like you and other lovely people in my network now. But these 5 qualities are leadership qualities that are missing from the way we develop leaders today. And ironically, the trends show us, and they might not be called fresh thinking because of nature, etc., but the sentiment remains the same. These are the 5 things that we need for future leaders to be successful. Nobody's even talking about the next generation that comes after Generation Z, Generation Alpha, right? 2.5 million born every week. In 12, 13 years, they'll be starting their first roles in organizations. So we need to be starting to think about them too. So that's the background to Fired. And we've created a methodology and a framework and a coaching model and all sorts of ways to integrate these qualities into organizations and how they identify, recruit, onboard, and develop leaders. So fresh thinking, and we probably don't have time to go through all of them at the moment, but just one that's relevant.
Maybe let's start off with fresh thinking. How would you describe what fresh thinking is to a new client?
Yeah, it's the ability to dare to think and act differently. All right. It's the leader who has the courage created by the culture and the way that they're identified, cultivated, and embraced as fresh thinkers. Because in my simple calculation from doing lots of research from Clayton Christensen to Whitney Johnson, these are experts in disruption, as we all know, is that innovation comes from disruption. I'm doing a fishbone here, right? Disruption comes from the ability to have disruptive thinking capability, and disruptive thinking comes from fresh thinking. So once you've laid the foundations for a leader to start thinking and acting differently, you get them curious. They ask why. They challenge. That when people say that'll never work, they ask why, right? So they bring new ideas to the table. Remember, 82% of Chinese and Asian investors from the Global Innovation Index will not invest in companies whose leadership doesn't embrace in disruptive thinking, right? Think about that. I'm just connecting the dots for everybody. I want everybody to start to see that these fresh thinkers, when they're seen in organizations as asking too many questions, they're that irritating mosquito that just won't leave you alone. Actually, what they're doing is they're purpose driven. They're innovative by nature. They ask questions by nature to evolve things. They don't care about politics. They don't play a political game. They're in it for the organization's wider mission. That's what a fresh thinker is.
Yeah, absolutely. And we have time constraints, but I think the statement there from Mike Stevenson is really, really apposite. Leaders developed through formal education have been bred in an environment of compliance, and yet it's they who occupy most leadership positions. And I think that is the paradox. How do we break this chain of misguided addiction to the wrong paradigms?
I love it, Mike. I'd love to connect with you offline anyway, and I'll do that. But in my simple philosophy, think of the startup curve, right? You've got the early adopters, you've got the mainstream, and you've got the laggards. We all know that the mainstream follow the early adopters. We all know that the laggards follow the mainstream. I don't care about the laggards and the mainstream personally, right? So I only work with clients that are progressive and are waking up and are actually ready to embrace. So if there's a client out there and they're wondering if they're ready, that they're thinking everybody else is wrong and they're right, well, at some point those clients will begin to see the impact of dysfunction and ineffective leadership practices on their organization's bottom line. When that happens, and it will happen, then they can start to become open to a different way of leadership for the future. So I don't even, and this narrows my market, Simon, and who I serve, because I'm not interested in having to persuade a client. A client comes to me when they already know the future it requires this. So that's how I when I look at clients and readiness, we even have tools that help clients determine if they're ready for this. And if they're stuck in the matrix, the blue pill, red pill, then it's only a matter of time before they either adapt or die, quite simply.
Yep. You're right. It's only a matter of time, and it's great to see Dolores, Andrew there. Great conversation. And I've really enjoyed. The time's gone really fast. And I think we'll leave it at that. This is just a taster of the series. We have 3 more episodes. We're really going to dig deeper into this whole area and become increasingly provocative and really get people to think about new paradigms and new ways of thinking and challenge old ways of thinking as we go through. So Paul, that's been great, and it's wonderful. And I recommend people have a look at Paul's book on fired leadership. And thanks everybody for your comments, and we'll see you next time. Take care. Thanks very much, Paul. Thank you.
Oh, I was going to ask you before we go. Can I just leave anyone with a reflection question?
Absolutely, and also your contact details as well, and how people can connect with you.
Just a reflection question, and do it in your own time. I'd love you to start to begin to explore how you can start reframing leaders that annoy you, irritate you, and are rebellious. Right? I'd just like you to start to think about looking at them differently, because what that does is that helps you to start challenging your assumptions that you hold about these types of leaders, because you'd be very surprised what they can contribute to your organization. So please, I implore you, just start to look at them a little bit differently today and tomorrow and see what they can do for you. And you can find me, paul@leadership.com, or on LinkedIn, Paul McCarthy. I'm quite prominent on there. So yeah, reach out and let's chat.
That's great. I can see there's a huge interest in this subject. So let's keep building it, and we'll build the interest. And let's make the snowball get bigger as it goes down the mountain. Let's get people really on board with really kind of challenging the status quo, because business needs this, and we owe it to business. So thanks so much. Thanks so much, Paul, and thanks everybody for your comments. We'll see you next time. Take care. Thank you.
Thanks, Simon.